I just wonder what Donald Trump is going to do if in a couple of weeks' time he does think that Vladimir Putin has just been tapping him along. What is the ultimatum here? What is the threat that Donald Trump is making?
Shall we start with Ukraine? Because we're hoping there might be some sort of development, but everyone's holding their breath. President Trump has given President Putin 2 weeks to prove that he's serious about ending the war in Ukraine before Washington changes its approach to the Russian leader. Here was Donald Trump speaking earlier this evening.
We're going to find out whether or not he's tapping us along or not. And if he is, we'll respond a little bit differently. But it'll take about a week and a half, 2 weeks. We have Mr. Witkoff is here, who's doing a phenomenal job, is dealing with them very strongly right now. They seem to want to do something, but until the document is signed, I can't tell you. Nobody can. I'm very disappointed at what happened a couple of nights now where people were killed in the middle of what you would call a negotiation. I'm very disappointed by that.
Well, he referred there to the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. But of course, there is an awful lot of scepticism about whether this is a genuine move forward. We've been hearing from a couple of people in the programme. I'll get your comments, both of you, on what they say. Let me just let you hear what they've said. John Luff, for example, the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategy Centre, told us that peace in Ukraine is the very last thing on Putin's mind.
Putin believes that he can almost certainly gain, literally gain more ground in Ukraine, weaken the resolve of the Ukrainians to continue this extraordinary fight. And he is putting a lot of resources into this. The Russians are effectively starting a new summer offensive now. And his goal is, I think, not just to gain more territory, but just to break the Ukrainians' will to fight. So in other words, if he can reach that point, then he's a much better chance of imposing a peace settlement on them, which is effectively forcing the Ukrainians to capitulate.
And then there's John Foreman, a former UK defence attaché to Ukraine and Russia, who said that Putin's demands are clear to see.
Putin and Russia want to deny Ukrainian sovereignty to determine its own future. So that's about signing agreements with NATO, having say its foreign policy, demanding reduction of its military power, and also having demand in its domestic affairs by demanding election or regime change as the Russians will see it in the elections. I think more widely, the Russians want, when they talk about root causes, they're talking about the West and America in particular not promising NATO enlargement, reducing sanctions, and also having the frozen money, which has been frozen in the West, back.
Well, there we are, two views. Neither of them very optimistic about what might come out of this. But Rebecca, first of all, what did you think when you heard this latest move? Do you have any belief that Putin might have intentions to end the war?
I mean, I think it's one of those issues that it's as much about ego as it is about politics. And the difficulty is neither Zelensky nor Putin can afford to lose face. And so I think there should be an appetite to end the war because, it's the human instinct and the loss of life is not insignificant on either side. But my concern is that the sort of international reputation and standing that Putin thinks comes from being, inverted commas, strong might be considered more important than that continued loss of life, which might make it appealing for him to just continue throwing more and more bodies and to continue the war for as long as he sees fit.
Yeah, well, we heard there that there could be preparations behind the scenes for a summer offensive, a chance to gain more territory. What do you think, Albie?
I just wonder what Donald Trump is going to do if in a couple of weeks' time he does think that Vladimir Putin has just been tapping him along. What is the ultimatum here? What is the threat that Donald Trump is making? Is the threat that there are going to be more economic sanctions on Russia? Well, there have already been a lot of economic sanctions on Russia. They don't really seem to have had a huge effect on the Russian economy or Russia's ability to carry on fighting this war. Is the ultimatum going to be that he's going to allow Ukraine to have more access to American weapons in a similar way that Merz, the German chancellor, is funding Ukrainian weapons now and made that announcement earlier on today? Is that going to be the threat that Donald Trump is going to make? I think a lot hinges on what Donald Trump is actually prepared to do after this period where he's deciding whether or not Vladimir Putin is tapping him along.
Yeah, I mean, he's issued those messages on social media, hasn't he? Written in capitals, Vladimir stop, and Vladimir is crazy or gone crazy. But he does have the option of more sanctions up his sleeve, and he hasn't yet deployed them. He's coming under pressure, though. Some of our interviewees were saying, look, there will be pressure if he doesn't pull his finger out and do something. There'll be pressure from Republicans like Mike Pompeo, Newt Gingrich. He'll say that Trump is being played and he needs some stick along with the carrots. What do you think, Rebecca? Any chance of that?
It really reminds me of when you have a toddler and you say, I'm going to count to 3, and then if you don't stop that, and then you count to 3 and they don't stop that, and you have no power. And actually, one of the things that anybody who is good at parenting, not me, will tell you is that if you say there is going to be a consequence for an action, you have to do it. And, I think international politics are not that different from parenting sometimes. And I fear for what happens if you say there's going to be consequences and then you wheel out a sort of half-hearted additional sanction, which, as Albie says, has not achieved very much so far. Economic sanctions don't seem to have made them feel very sorry for anything. So I do worry about that. I think, he, in fairness to Donald Trump, not something I like saying, he did a pretty good job with North Korea and with Kim Jong-un. So I suppose my hope is that whatever worked there might work again. That's my most optimistic take that I can give you.
And the thing is, Albie, when Donald Trump does get tough and does actually focus on things like increasing the spending by European nations on NATO, he can have an impact, can't he?
He can have an impact when there's something the people that he's having an impact on want from him that only he can give them. And I suppose my question is, what is it that Russia wants from America that only America can give them? Russia's been pretty much isolated from the international stage for many, many years now. They don't really seem to be that bothered about being part of the international global trade system, being part of the kind of international liberal order that we have. Whereas when we talk about the UK, when we talk about the European Union, yes, the UK and the European Union, they want to be part of the club that America leads. Russia doesn't want to be part of that club. So I think it's one thing America getting tough with us. It's another thing America getting tough with Russia. I'm just not really sure what's in it for Putin, and that's what worries me.
It's been really interesting as well to see the way that Germany is getting more involved in this under their new Chancellor Merz, for example, saying that he will help Ukraine with the development of new long-range missiles. This is something that President Biden took a long time to approve, but finally there was an agreement to use those sorts of missiles into Russian territory. But I guess, Rebecca, while the Ukrainians will accept and welcome the help, it comes with risks, doesn't it?
I think it comes with enormous risk because you are poking quite an angry bear, and also similarly there is this particular risk that we might end up giving Ukraine the exact wrong amount of help, so enough help that the war can drag on and on and on and on, and more people can lose their lives, but not enough help that they can actually make any meaningful strides forward, or become a sufficiently meaningful threat that Russia wants to change their behaviour. And I do worry that perhaps that is the kind of level of help that they're getting at the moment, and I don't know what the correct answer is to that. I'm delighted that I'm not in a decision-making capacity there.
Yeah, you and me both. Albie, as I was talking to our guests John Luff and John Foreman, it came into my mind, what's happened to the idea of a coalition of the willing? We don't know yet, do we, if there is going to be any scope at all for the big idea, the big scheme that was led by Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. I don't know if you've heard anything, but I don't think I have for a long while.
No, we haven't heard much about the coalition of the willing, but I think it was a bit of a smoke and a mirror in the first place. I mean, they were talking about, I think, less than 100,000 troops between the UK, France, Germany, and whoever this coalition of the willing was going to be. There are hundreds of thousands, I think over 500,000 Ukrainian troops that are on the front line. I always thought it was a little bit insulting to think that, oh, we could just have 50,000 good Western European soldiers, and that will really push things over the edge because the Ukrainians don't really know what they're doing, apparently. So I always thought that the coalition of the willing was more of a PR stunt than an actual policy. And ultimately, that coalition of the willing would only really have happened with America's backing. And I come back to the point that I made before. What is the threat that Donald Trump is making when he says, if Vladimir Putin is just tapping us along, there are going to be consequences? Is that consequence that America is going to get a lot more involved when it comes to firepower and manpower in Europe in a way which is going to change the way Russia is behaving?
Yes, or is it just the threat of more sanctions? You're absolutely right. We don't know. And this is just one of many things that Donald Trump touched on at the White House today. We'll be keeping an eye on next Monday as well. I mean, imagine if it does lead to something. Imagine, Albie, if we could get face-to-face talks between Putin and Zelensky. Now, wouldn't that be something?
It would be something, but the way that Russia is the one driving when these talks might happen in Turkey makes me think it's a bit of a ploy to tap Donald Trump along. So the Russians can say, well, look, we're making an effort. We're suggesting talks in Turkey. It's Ukraine causing all of the issue. And then the talks happen. Putin doesn't show up, Zelensky doesn't show up, and the same thing that happened before happens again. I'd love for the two gentlemen to be able to sit down, have a conversation, come to some sort of agreement that might mean Ukraine losing some of the territory that Russia has occupied and the war coming to an end. I think that would be an outcome that everyone could live with. But the question is will the two men ever sit down at the same table? It's not happened yet, and we'll wait and see what happens in the future.
Well, maybe, Rebecca, it's time to get the Pope involved again.
That does seem to be the thing that we just go to now, isn't it? That's the just wait till your father gets home, just wait till Il Pepe comes home. And look, he seems like a very nice man. I was very pleased with the election that was made, but I do slightly worry about where we are globally if we're regularly having to say maybe the Pope could help.